Okay, so back to Hume. Oh no. So getting back to David Hume, we were talking about causality, cause and effect, and I didn't feel like I really finished what was going on there. And his issue was we feel like it's a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. The thing is, the necessity there can't be logical necessity because we can imagine something else happening instead of what routinely happens. So I can imagine the cue ball missing the 8 ball because the 8 ball doesn't dance. It's goofy stuff. I can imagine it. But what Hume then goes on to say is that if I can imagine it, then it's not logical necessity that explains the necessity because you can at least imagine the contradiction. And he argues that if it were logically necessary, you couldn't imagine something else happening. It would be impossible. I don't know about that argument, but that's his argument. And then, so he goes on to point out that since it's not logical necessity, what kind of necessity is it? And his answer is that it's only the necessity we associate with our memories. Since it's always been that way as far as we can remember, it seems necessary to us that this will happen. But then the argument is memory is not, foolproof. You can have a false memory. In fact, we discussed lots of different examples where people have been led to think something that happened that didn't, or all kinds of issues. You're taking psychology courses, it's a fun thing to do. We saw in the experiment too that the body isn't necessarily the real body necessarily, but what we are used to thinking is our body. And even if just in a few minutes you get used to thinking that fake arm is your arm, you react as if it is, etc. So that was one aspect of David Hume's criticisms. And remember, this is all based on the idea that everything that's happening in our experience is happening inside our mind. Pardon? It is. I was thinking of asking university advancement on the 1st of April. Are you sure you spelled your sign correct? It doesn't look like university is spelled correctly. Can you imagine the shock when they all come rushing out and then I go, April Fool. Wouldn't that be neat? Might be fun. Okay. So resemblance was the next one that we were talking about. So how is this blue dot the same as this blue dot? How is that blue? And the trouble is that, well, if it is exactly the same, it's identical, how can it be in two places at once? And, we don't have a solution to that. Although, I wish Ellie were here because she said something about vectors and things, and I was like, tell me more. And we didn't. So if she comes in later, remind her that she missed out on a terrific opportunity to explain.
She'll just be like, okay.
Gosh, I shouldn't talk about students.
Oh,
there she is!
Hey! See?
I was just.
Cheers?
Yes.
We're all waiting for you.
Norm! No, that's another TV show. No, it was the idea of the blue versus the blue, and you said something about vectors, and you're confusing vectors and...
Some velocity can either go forward or backwards. Speed can only go forward. That's the difference between a vector and a scalar.
Okay.
And we were hoping that we could explain that two things can't be the same place.
This blue dot and this blue dot are identical, except they can't be identical because this one is on the left and this one's on the right. So they're separate.
My argument was, I'm not classifying the blue dot, I'm classifying the color blue.
Which takes us down a level, but then we could go down. We could keep going down a level. There's a principle associated with that called the distinguishable is separable principle. So if I can distinguish this one on the left and that one on the right, then I can separate them somehow. But how do we do that? And remember, if what he's trying to do is imagine that this is all going on as the professor from Sussex said in that short video, the TED talk, that we're hallucinating. This is a hallucination. But these two hallucinations are in the same mind, and yet we're saying that they're identical. But how are we doing that? And then I mentioned contiguity in time and space. How do we explain that when we're talking about everything happening in our minds, right? How do you explain things being far away or long ago? How is it long ago when it's in my mind right now as I'm thinking about it? It doesn't seem to be long ago. Cause and effect, relations of ideas and matters of fact, etc. Something else I want to mention about David Hume before I get into what will take us into Kant, and that is Hume argues that emotion or passion is, or reason is a slave of the passions, I suppose is the easiest way to remember it. And what he means by that is that if we think about kind of an ethical map, or how I draw ethics. I put Aristotle over here, and his focus is on the I, the self. So I don't know if you could see that or not, but the focus is on the self. Remember, for Aristotle, flourishing, individual flourishing is the goal of our life, right? Eudaimonia, the flourishing of the self. It does require a good society, so you do want to help your society flourish, because if the society isn't flourishing, you can't flourish yourself, right? And so on. But for Aristotle, the main focus is on the self. For Hume, it's the community. So the community is where you get your whole concept of flourishing and self and everything else that goes with that. And as a result, by the time of David Hume, remember he died in 1776, right? Famous year because of Pinot Noir being just absolutely the best ever, right? Different communities had different values. We still see, we of course see that today, but Hume's day, remember Locke, and others, they're absolutely shocked that other countries don't know about Aristotle. The missionaries, when they first went to China and they discovered that no one there knew about Aristotle, how could you not know about Aristotle, right? Almost as silly, I think that even a sillier, in my mind, experience is going to Hawaii, being in the Bishop Museum, which is on Honolulu, and as you're in there, you see the wool suits that the missionaries wore on October 1st, because it was, going to be winter now. And so they took out of, their cases, their wool underwear and wool suits, and put them on because, well, it's October in Hawaii, right? And the craziest thing too is that they insisted on the natives that they wear those kinds of clothes too. So if you see King Kamehameha in his painting, he's sitting there in such a suit, you know. Now, of course, if you go to Hawaii today, and you especially visit the beach on a normal day, what kind of clothing do you see? Well, you don't actually see very much clothing, right? You know, and I won't demonstrate, you know, with videos or anything, so that you can see how that works, right? Just so dumb. You're thinking, you know, okay, these missionaries are from Boston. You know, in Boston in October, you get out your suits and you put them on, you know, to be warm, right? But why would you even think that Hawaii would demand such clothing? Just, you know, humans, you know. And that wasn't very long ago. That was like the 1860s. I mean, you know, that's like, you think, weren't people smarter then? No, they weren't. Maybe a lot of people aren't that smart today, actually. Could be. I'm not going to point, you know, I'm not going to point in the general direction of Washington, D.C., for example, or, you know, things of that sort. But so the self is over here, and Hume is focused on how the values that a person grows up with comes from their community, and community values are different from community to community, right? And so the we is the focus for David Hume. And then when he gets into reason, and you're talking about logical argumentation and so on, he'll point out that you use reason to argue for the values that you hold. You see how that works? So passion, you know, rules, basically, right? So I can use reason, you know, to absolutely argue for the passions that I have. So reason is the slave of the passions, right? And it's not the other way around. It's not like, oh, well, your arguments are so sound, I have to change my values, right? And you can see that, of course, in the annoying conflicts that we get into today. People are reasonable on both sides sometimes, and they argue with one another, and their arguments seem sound. But when you get right down to it, you know, no, the basic value on this side and the basic value on this side are different, and you're just not going to be able to persuade them using reason to get over that, it seems like. And so Hume is associated with that kind of point of view. And as a result, when the feminists started, either first wave, second wave, third wave, I forget which wave it was, but at a certain point they thought of Hume as kind of a philosophical hero, because they were making the assumption that women are more passionate, men are cold and rational. What a crazy, you know, I don't know where that came from, but you know, and since Hume was on the side of passion, they thought Hume was kind of like the feminist philosopher. The bad news is, as far as we know, Hume had no special interest at all in feminism or anything of that sort. Not, you know, I don't know where that came from. But you actually see that they think of him as a philosopher associated with that. But so here we get, let me, if you want, I can also put Kant up here, I usually do, and John Stuart Mill down here, and I'll explain as we go why I put them there. Remember, this is the I and the self. This is certitude, or certainty, and this is uncertainty. So if you figure out your map and you figure out, where do we go, etc. I put pragmatism in here, and that's because we're Americans and we are familiar with all these theories, and we get very confused trying to figure out which one ought to dominate in specific situations. That's kind of Uh-oh, this is not a very good eraser. Made sure I had a really good brand new magic marker for this. And an old beat up eraser.
You should try using the vacuum marker, like the.
I could do like that crazy professor and just rub my jacket and it all erases by the time actually he was writing this way, but his stomach was up against the board, so by the time he finished and you looked at it, it was all erased already. You saw that move. Okay. So the next use of this magic marker I want to do is, let's see, I'll put synthetic down here, and analytic up here, and I put a priori up here, a posteriori up here. So how does this work? So this is in a sense Kant's analysis of the basic arguments that Hume is using in order to say that metaphysics is impossible. How so? Well, metaphysics is kind of the background explanation for how it is that we can know things. But if Hume is taking the empiricist point of view to the max and saying that the only thing we can know for certain is what we're experiencing at the moment. So I can't even trust my own memory.